too loud?
Perfect.
Works okay? Okay, good. All right, I'd like to begin by telling you about an article that I read on December 14th, 2010 in the New York Times. It was an article about a Spanish windmill company. Windmills were just coming into their own in that era. Of course, in order to generate electricity as an alternative source of energy. Gamnesa, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right, I don't speak Spanish, but it was a very successful company. It decided to go to China in the mid-1990s. At first, it did extremely well in China because there weren't competitors. It captured the market, so to speak. It had initially in the first year or two, somewhere around 80% market share. When it reached that level of success, the Chinese Communist Party decided that they would put into effect a rule that 80% of the ingredients that go into the making of a windmill had to be produced locally in China. This forced, in effect, Gamnesa to teach elements of its technology to a wide variety of suppliers. Within a few years, those suppliers banded together and created a competitor to Gamnesa. In the fullness of time, that competitor overwhelmed Gamnesa in the sense that it captured almost all the market share that Gamnesa had captured. And then finally, the Chinese competitor went global and was so competitive globally that Gamnesa was forced to sell itself, which it did to Siemens, and I don't remember the year. I was reading that article on that day in December 2010, knowing that we were just about ready to leave for China, my wife and I. I had no idea how to think about that article because I lacked a frame of reference. The backdrop here is very simple. Silicon Valley Bank got started in 1983. It lasted exactly 40 years. It disappeared 2 years ago. By the way, I have long since retired from Silicon Valley Bank. I'm not responsible. A couple of months ago, I got a call from Fortune magazine. They wanted to interview me about my book. And I thought, this is great, you know, this is the kind of publicity that I need. But then when they finally got together with me, they said, we have to have 2 interviews. The first one has to be about your experience at SVB, not about your book. And then we'll get to your book in a subsequent interview. I was understandably disappointed. And I said, why? And they said to me, you're like a man with a chicken sitting on his head. Nobody is going to listen to anything you say until they can figure out why that chicken is sitting on your head. So we've got to take the chicken off your head with our first interview. So I just want to say emphatically, I was not responsible for the demise of SPB. And it was not the bank's business model. It was a huge mistake, having nothing to do with the business model. It was made by the management team somewhere around 2021 or so. In any case, I've spent most of my life providing financial services, and in particular debt, to early stage venture-backed technology companies. I joined Silicon Valley Bank in 1990 when I was 7 years old. And in 2001, the board appointed me CEO of the bank. I was CEO for 10 years, 2001 through 2010. And as CEO, I think I only did 3 things that were particularly noteworthy. And those 3 things I did all within the first year. So I made 3 big decisions in my first year in 2001. The first was that we would get rid of all of the companies in our portfolio that were not involved with technology. When I became CEO, only 25% of the companies in our portfolio were involved with technology. I wanted a bank that served only technology companies. So we eliminated 75% of our portfolio. We politely and patiently asked people to go find another bank. And then we filled the gap with technology companies. The second one was, up until I became CEO, to the extent that we dealt with technology, we only dealt with early stage technology companies. But that was kind of self-defeating because early stage technology companies require a lot of work on the part of the banker, and the banker earns almost nothing for doing it. I wanted to keep those companies as they grew bigger, because big technology companies, interestingly enough, require less work, and bankers earn more money. So I made that decision. That was number 2. And the third decision was to go global, because of my belief that technology is an inherently global industry. You can't be cutting edge anywhere unless you're cutting edge everywhere. You can be cutting edge for a short period of time in one location, but it won't last long. Technology knows no borders. It crosses borders. Even Mr. Trump could not build a wall high enough to keep technology from moving from one continent to another. So those are the only 3 decisions that I made of any significance in my 10 years as CEO, and I made them all in the first year. We started going to China in the year 2000, actually 1 year prior to my becoming CEO. We built our first office in China in 2005. But because any activity in China, business activity in China, requires a license, and we had no license, all we could do was walk around and introduce ourselves to people. Our purpose was to introduce ourselves to enough people that we finally found somebody who liked us and was interested in sponsoring us. We wanted a license to build a bank in China. In 2008, I finally met the prince. I say the prince because prior to that we'd been kissing frogs, hoping that we would find a prince. And in 2008, I found the prince. It was Mr. Chen Anjia, the party secretary of the Yangpu district, which is one of the 19 districts in Shanghai. We called him Lao Chen, because that means old China, but it's a sign of affection. Lao Chen took a real interest in me. Every single time I got together with him, he gave me a bear hug. That's unusual in China. As a matter of fact, when I first started studying Chinese, one of the chapters in one of my initial readers was entitled, "Chinese people don't hug strangers," but Lao Chen hugged me every time. It was weird. But he was a good man, and he began to introduce me to people that could enable us eventually to get a banking license in China. And in point of fact, in the year 2011, a year after my wife and I arrived, we moved to China for 4 years in order to build this bank. A year after we arrived, we got a banking license. We were the first American commercial bank in world history to receive a license to enter into a joint venture with a Chinese commercial bank. under the Chinese Communist Party system. So I say world history in a grandiose fashion. We know that the Chinese Communist Party took control of China in 1949. So it's not as big a deal as I'm making it sound, but it was a pretty big deal. I've got to say that. And in 2009, Lao Chun introduced me to a man I'll never forget. A man with a virtually unpronounceable name for an American speaker anyway. Liu Zhongcheng. Liu Zhongcheng was the party secretary of Shanghai at the time. And when Xi Jinping came to power at the end of 2012, Liu Zhongcheng was elevated to the standing committee, meaning that by the end of 2012, he was one of the 7 most influential, so-called powerful people in China. Now what I'd like to do is describe 3 events that took place during our 4 years there, all having to do with the development of our bank in China. And of course, there were hundreds of events over a 4-year period. But I list 3 because they give you a sense of what I call the arc. And the arc is the typical pattern. That's what I mean by it. In 2009 and in 2010, I met with Liu Zhongcheng at least 4 times. And in the course of those meetings, this is what he said to me. He said, "We have searched the world over, looking for the bank that would be most important to us in terms of learning to finance technology companies here in China. We have searched the world over and we have found your bank. Your bank is the most important bank in the world." And then he said, which I'll never forget, and I love to repeat this, especially when friends of mine from these other 2 banks are in the room. He said, "Your bank is more important than Goldman Sachs." And then he said, "And your bank is more important than Morgan Stanley." And then he said, "You're not going to believe me, but I swear to God, this is what he said on more than one occasion. Ken, you may be the smartest American I've ever met. I don't meet many Americans that really understand China, but you do, Ken, and we want you here. Now, I want you to know I'm not as arrogant as you may think I am. I'm actually tend to be a little bit more on the humble side. I knew I was being played. It's clear to me I'm not the smartest American with respect to any topic in any room. But I will tell you it felt good. And I will also say that it gave me the sense that we were en route to getting the license that we wanted. So I was happy about that. That's event number 1. Event number 2 that I'll tell you about would have been at the end of 2011. My wife and I had already been there for 11 months. And government officials came to me and they said, "We've succeeded. This is a glorious day for us and for you. We have your license. We are so happy." And here it is. And of course I was happy too, until they told me 2 other things. The first one was that to actually operate as a bank in China requires somewhere between 15 and 20 different licenses, depending on the nature of your activity. This license only entitles you to call yourself a bank. and you can open the front door, and you can greet customers. But in order to take a deposit, you need a deposit-taking license, and that's not included. And in order to make a loan, you need a loan-making license, and that's not included. And in fact, there are several different types of loan-making licenses for different types of loans, and several different types of deposit-taking licenses for different types of deposits, and licenses for exchanging money, and licenses for, and the list goes on. So that was a little disappointing. And then he told me the other thing. And that is that, sadly, we have a law in China. And we wish we didn't have it. We'd like to be able to get rid of it, but we can't. And the law in China, which has been around since Deng Xiaoping, says that if you are a brand new bank in China with any foreign ownership whatsoever, you cannot use Chinese currency for the first 3 years. So folks, that's like saying, I'm giving you a license to set up a Chinese restaurant in San Francisco, but you can't use any Chinese ingredients for the first 3 years. There was nothing we could do. So I turned the running of the day-to-day affairs, of which there were virtually none, over to somebody else in the bank, and I devoted the rest of the other 3 years of my time in China to charting a course to Xi Jinping, hoping that I could get an exception. And I believe that I actually reached Xi Jinping, although not in person. I don't know for sure. I was told I did. But we didn't get any exception. The third major event I want to describe to you in order to give you a sense of this arc is that after the 3 years were over, government officials came to me and said, your 3 years are over now. Now you can start using Chinese currency. And it's a glorious day for us and for you. Everything they did, even horrible things, were on glorious days. And then they added one more thing. They said that we so admire your business model that we decided to start a bank of our own using your business model. And it's going to open in Shanghai in 2 weeks. And would you please spend time with the management team explaining to them some of the things about your business model that they don't yet understand? And they said that seriously. They weren't just pulling my leg. So, what I learned in the fullness of time was that my experience was not atypical. I'm not saying that every Western company that goes to China has an identical experience, but I'm saying that most have an experience that at least resembles the experience that I had. Some of the companies know it. Some of the companies don't know it. And some of the companies are just not at that point in the arc where it will become apparent. Because in some people's cases, it only takes a couple of years. And in other people's cases, like General Motors, it takes 35 years. But even General Motors is withdrawing from China with its tail between its legs at this point in time. So don't worry. getting impatient, I'm almost done. Most every Western company that goes to China goes with the intention of being successful. Nobody goes there in order to fail. So why don't they succeed? I've thought long and hard about this, and I believe there are three categories of reasons why Western companies are often, not always, but often not successful in China. The first category would be fit into the category of nobody's fault. Not our fault, not their fault. The truth is, and I do think, at least the few people in the audience who are Chinese and are currently living in the US and will agree with me, China and the US are quite a bit different from each other. I've traveled to many, many countries and done business in many, many countries. I don't know of any country that I believe is more different from the US than China. There may be some, Bhutan would fit, and I've been in Bhutan, but they don't have any technology anyway in Bhutan. China is different from the US in terms of the way it governs itself, in terms of its culture, and in terms of almost everything else. I hope you're noticing, I have not said there's anything wrong with what China does. I've said it's different. That's the important thing. It is so different that it's hard to understand it, at first at least. Some people live there for years and still don't understand China. And in fact, the smartest people I've met, smartest Americans I've met in China, are these so-called old China hands, they've been there for 30 years, they will say to you, the longer I'm here, the less I understand. And I think that's the first category of reasons why it's difficult. The second category of reasons, I would say, is because it's our fault. We, the Americans. And why do I say our fault? Because number one is we're overly confident. It's almost always the CEO who makes the decision to go to China. And CEOs are by definition overly confident. You don't get to be CEO by being underly confident. You get to be CEO by being overly confident. And we think that we can crack the code. We think, okay, a lot of other companies haven't done that well, but we'll figure it out. Also, we have these things in our heads, actually all humans do, called mental models. These mental models help us to understand what's going on around us. They're based on prior experience. And when you go to another country, when any of us goes to another country, we take our mental models with us. And we observe what we experience, we think about it, and we superimpose our mental models. And then we interpret what we experience based on our mental models from the past. And if you're an American and you're going to England with your mental models and using them to interpret what you see, you'll probably get it right a lot of the time. Not all the time, but most of the time. And even in Germany, you'll probably get it right most of the time, or at least a lot of the time. But if you go to China with your mental models and superimpose them on what you see, you're almost guaranteed not to understand it. I'll give you one example in case that sounded too esoteric. Here in the US, business people like myself grow up believing that party affiliation is one thing. There are Republicans and there are Democrats, but it's one thing. It has very little to do with business. Your business affiliation is another thing. And if you're in government, that's another thing. When I got to China, my primary conversation partner was the CEO of our joint venture partner, Shanghai Pudong Development Bank. Mr. Fu Jianhua. And when I would have conversations with Mr. Fu in the first year, I would often wonder, well, is he wearing his Chinese Communist Party hat? Or is he wearing his president of Shanghai Pudong Development Bank hat? Or is he, because he was also a member of the Shanghai municipal government, is he wearing his Shanghai municipal government hat? I would wonder that. And it took me at least a year before I figured out he didn't even know he had hats. He didn't think in terms of three separate categories. It was all the same thing. That doesn't exist here. We're not used to that. It's not something we intuitively understand. And our prior experience in the US makes it harder for us to understand that because it's so different. I will say one more thing that falls into the it's our fault category. We don't prepare sufficiently. We just don't prepare sufficiently. We think if we read the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, we already know what's happening. We don't realize that if you really want to understand what's happening in China, you have to read. I've now in the past 15 years read over 200 books on Chinese history, Chinese culture, Chinese governance, and I still don't fully understand what I would need to understand to be successful. And it takes a long time to read over 200 books. At least me, I'm not a fast reader. Then the third category would be the CCP. The CCP, Chinese Communist Party, does not make it any easier for us. And I'll tell you why. Number one is, they, for the most part, never read the book Getting to Yes. Now you wonder what I mean by that. Almost everybody of my age bracket, and a lot of younger people in business have taken a class in negotiation, maybe more than one. Almost every time the class in negotiation is based on a book called Getting to Yes, that is a byproduct of something that took place a long time ago, and that is the Harvard Negotiation Project. And that's what we all learn to do. I'm not saying we all do it, and I will gladly point out that President Trump doesn't do it at all. But most American business people have the approach that's described in Getting to Yes. It's basically you and I are negotiating with each other, not against each other, with each other. We have to find out what you need, we have to find out what I need, we have to craft a solution that makes both of us happy. Now, not everybody does that, but that's what we all aspire to do. They haven't read that book. In China, negotiation is based on leverage. Whoever has more leverage is going to get a bigger deal, a better deal. And it's not, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. Nobody thinks it's wrong. People, when they enter into a negotiation in China, they try to figure out how much leverage do you have and how much leverage do I have. And if you have more, you should get a better deal. And if I have more, I should get a better deal. And if I have more and I don't insist on a better deal, I must be stupid. They will lose respect for me if I have more leverage but I don't insist on a better deal. It's a different way of thinking about it. It's not wrong, it's different. So, I'm almost done. almost every time I speak to audiences, and because I'm trying to sell my book, I do it regularly. Somebody, it may not happen today because most of you appear to be students, but somebody comes up out of the audience afterwards and says, Ken, I so enjoyed that. That's the same experience I had 20 years ago, or 15 years ago, or 10 years ago in China. But I never talked about it. And it's nice to hear somebody admit it. Why don't they talk about it? American business people don't talk about what happened to them in China. I think there are 3 reasons. There are a lot of books written about US-China relations, by the way. Lots of them. But they're almost all written by government people, big tech people, journalists. They're written by people who actually have not done business in China. Business people, up until just this last year, do not write books about what happened to them in China for the most part. There are only a handful of books out there. Why not? Well, I think there are 3 reasons. Number 1 is they are very much afraid of repercussions. They're afraid that the Chinese Communist Party will somehow punish their company. And in fact, before our bank disappeared 2 years ago, my successor, the CEO of the bank, starting when I left to go to China, told me that if I write a book about what happened to us in China, he's going to disown me. He'll publicly disown me because he doesn't want anybody to know. That's one reason. The second reason is it's embarrassing. How many people want to write a book about how stupid I was? The truth is, I was hosed in China. And how many people want to write a book that says how I was hosed in China, signed Ken Wilcox? Does anybody really want to go out of their way to appear stupid? No. And it takes a lot of time to write a book. Why would I devote 3 or 4 years to writing a book about how stupid I am? And the third reason is, and this is the least important of the reasons, some people don't know they've been screwed. It just doesn't occur to them. They haven't figured it out. So my advice, when people say, and it sounds so dire, would you go to China again? Yeah, I would, actually. I probably won't now that I wrote this book. But yes, I would do the whole thing all over again. And this would be my advice to anybody who wants to go. I'm not saying don't go to China. I'm saying if you go to China, go with your eyes wide open. Don't bring your own prejudices with you. Try to understand what you see and try to deal with it more effectively than I did. Learn the game plan. There's a playbook that the CCP is using. Understand the playbook. Don't make assumptions. Take your time. Don't be in a rush. Learn the communication style. My assistant, who was a terrific assistant, after about 6 months in China, she got so angry with me one day. She said, Ken, you are never going to be successful in China, and it's your own fault. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, you have a terrible habit. You always say what you mean and mean what you say. We don't do that. Figure out what your leverage is and seek to prolong your leverage. Often we Americans give away our leverage way too fast. It's like you and I are trying to get a deal done. I want it done badly. You ask me to do something and I do it quickly in order to make you happy. That's throwing my leverage out the window. I should give it to you in tiny pieces over an extended period of time and demand that you do something in return each time. That's how to win, or at least not lose. So I'm going to end with 3 comments. The first one is, many people ask me, what is Xi Jinping trying to accomplish? I spent a lot of time trying to figure that out. I'm not sure that I know anything, but I'll tell you what I believe. His first priority is to keep the party in charge. That's more important than anything. And his second priority is to make the world safe for autocracy. The next thing I want to tell you is that starting about a year and a half ago, the Chinese Communist Party has begun hiring attorneys, American attorneys. There's one firm in LA in particular that they've hired more than once to go after American authors. And the way it works is, and I know this to be the truth because I have talked to people who have had this experience, and I've also discussed it with the Select Committee in Congress. The way it works is, you're an American author, you said something critical about the Chinese Communist Party, you get a letter in the mail. And it says, we don't like what you're writing. Cease and desist. Remove your writing from circulation. And give us a written apology with a written promise to stop. And the last thing I want to say is, because people often ask me, so I'll say who's in trouble? Did we like going to China? My answer is absolutely. My wife and I say to each other often, it was the best 4 years of our lives. It was the most interesting and the most fascinating and the best in terms of being a learning experience. And I'm so glad that we did it. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. What a fascinating journey you had in there. Hey, before we go on to a Q&A, can you say a little bit about what happened to SSVB after you left?
What happened?
Yeah, and is it still in operation now?
Oh no. SVB completely disappeared in March of 2023. And I'll give you 3 minutes on it. I don't want to talk a long time about it, because you didn't come here to hear this. It was not the SVB business model, meaning lending to technology companies is not what killed us. And that's fundamentally all we did, was lend money to technology companies. What killed us was this. Banks, good banks, try to have what's called an 80% loan to deposit ratio. In other words, if we get $100 in deposits, we'll lend $80 out. And we keep 20 dry powder in case somebody wants their money back. Some depositor walks in the front door and says, oh, I'd like my deposits back. So 80% of our deposits we lend. That's step number 1. Step number 2 is when the COVID came, our economy went into a slump, and the Federal Reserve pumped liquidity into the economy in order to buoy it up. There was so much money in the economy by the end of 21 and into 22 that our deposits shot way up. Our loans stayed the same, and our deposits went up by a factor of 5. So we had way too many deposits. Now, when the CFO sees all these extra deposits, the CFO almost always says, oh my gosh, we have all those extra deposits, we have to do something with them. Because otherwise we're wasting them. And so the CFO gets the bright idea, and this is not the first time in history this has happened, to take those excess deposits and buy long-term bonds. And I say long-term because long-term bonds have a higher interest rate than short-term bonds. And the longer the term, the higher the interest rate, the more they earn. And that makes the CFO the hero. He or she thinks. And here's the problem, though. If you've taken a finance course, you probably know that if you own a bond with an interest rate and rates in the market around you go down, your bond is worth even more than what you paid for it because it's got a better interest rate than the market. And so you actually get a really nice deal out of it. But if the rates around you go up, your bond becomes worth less because it has an interest rate that's lower than what people could get in the market. So what happened? Because there was so much money in the economy, we experienced inflation. When we experience inflation, the Federal Reserve raises rates in order to beat down inflation. The Federal Reserve raised rates. The value of all these long-term bonds went down, and the bank had a giant problem on its hands. $100 billion worth of bonds that were losing value. And they had to announce it. And they announced it, and it scared all of the customers so much that they pulled all their money out of our bank. And our bank lost half of its money in 36 hours. And we were within 72 hours dead. And that's actually what happened.
Well, thank you for more on this. It is fascinating as well. It's a different journey. So in what follows, we're gonna start a Q&A session. But I would like to take a moment to introduce our moderator today, Professor Keith Lorenzen. Professor Lorenzen specializes in economics of information, incentives, and institutions, with a primary focus on the development and governance of China. He received his PhD in economic analysis and policy from Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. His research spanned a wide range of fascinating topics, including governance and social control in China, media management, anti-corruption, environmental transparency, long-run economic growth, among many others. So thank you, Peter, for stepping up today from your sabbatical.
Okay, well, so it's a pleasure to be here and be a part of this conversation. Even before my academic career, I worked for a few years in China, helping no companies in finance, but just wandering around China, talking to businesses, trying to help international companies get started in China. And as I've told Ken before, it was really remarkable to be reading his book and sort of, because a lot of these stories were happening back then. They weren't with tech finance businesses, but they were with some company making a building material. And they'd move to China and they'd set up the business, they'd be welcomed, and then they'd find a year or two later that for some reason their business had dried up, and then it would turn out that, half of their company had been hired away to work a couple cities over or down the block and build a factory doing the same thing, which is kind of the low-tech version of, sounds like what happened to Ken. But now we're for open Q&A, so are there any questions from the audience, or I can kick it off while you guys are thinking about what you'd like to follow up on. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Do you think the introductory courses in business are taught correctly, in as much as it tends to be American business rather than business?
That's an interesting point. Nobody's ever asked me that, and I've never actually thought about it. But on the spur of the moment here, I think that's a really good point. And I don't know how business courses are taught today. I went to Harvard Business School 45 years ago, and we weren't learning the kinds of things that would have helped me. Otherwise, maybe I would have done better. But I do think that's an interesting point. I also think that I remember when I was at Harvard Business School, we had a course of negotiation, but it was totally based on the idea that everybody's using getting to yes. And so, of course, that was what they would teach. But it would have been much more valuable to teach more than one style, because you will encounter different styles in different parts of the world. And I think that it would behoove almost any business person to understand the style of negotiation in the part of the world where they're trying to do business. And I can illustrate that point, by the way, very simply. And that is, so if you're in China, you're obviously not going to spend all your time doing business. You're going to travel. You're going to try to see some things. You'll go to the Great Wall. Maybe you'll even see some other less well-known things. Wherever you go, you're going to find street vendors that are catering to tourists, and they'll have stuff for sale. And you'll see something that you like. Maybe it's a handmade wallet, and you'll pick it up off the counter and you'll say, "How much is this wallet?" And the person across the other side of the table will look at you and will say, $700. Then you'll say, well, either you'll say to yourself, I can't possibly afford it, so forget it. Or you'll say, $700? I would never pay that for a wallet, even if I could afford it, so forget it. Or you'll say, the person must think I'm incredibly stupid. Screw them, I'm not gonna even deal with them, I'm leaving. And you'll miss the whole point. Because the person on the other side of the table says $700, fully expecting that you'll come back and say $2.50. And you'll argue back and forth for 10 minutes, and you'll end up paying $25. And so if you don't understand how it works in a different culture, you'll never get the thing that you're trying to buy. That, I think, is a very simple but good explanation for why it's important to learn the way they do it elsewhere. Because it's not always the same. And getting indignant isn't going to do us any good anyway, because you're not going to change China by being indignant. One of the best China scholars in history was Spence at Harvard, and he wrote about 20 different books on China. The one that I like the most, largely because it was the shortest, is called To Change China. And it's the story of 10 different Westerners starting in the 1500s over a 500-year period that went to China with the idea of learning, and then subsequently they wanted to change the way the Chinese did things. And nobody changed China. Those people all went home, changed themselves. So we aren't going to change the people in other countries. We can adapt rather to them, or we can go home and lose out. So yes, it's a good idea.
I'll just jump in and say we do teach international business classes these days, at least at USF. So that's a major, some of our students do. So got to get the foundation in accounting and marketing. And of course, probably your boss is going to be in America, even if you're in China. So even if you're in other countries, having that, you kind of need to master both cultures. But that's certainly an important specialty to develop. Another question?
Within China, within China, to what extent do successful domestic upstarts face the same obstacles you described that international companies have moving into China?
And to what extent do successful upstarts in China face the same challenges? You mean within China or when they go to other countries?
No, within China.
Now, that's a darn good question. I'm glad you brought that up. You must have spent time in China. Yeah, because almost invariably, not today so much, I guess, but almost invariably, when I talk to groups, somebody who's spent a lot of time in business in China and is Chinese will come up to me afterwards and say, Ken, you gotta quit complaining. Because the Chinese Communist Party doesn't treat us any better than it treats you. We face the same challenges. And to a certain extent, I buy that. I agree with it. But it doesn't help me to know that. I guess it makes me feel better that they're getting screwed too. But I don't look at the world that way, that if I'm getting screwed, I feel better because you are too. But it's good, it's a darn good question, and a lot of Chinese business people will say, we get posed constantly by the party. So why should we feel sorry for you again?
We have a question from the audience. It's from Xiang Lin. So they asked that, did you know about the laws and permits required when you first decided to build a bank? Or was that only revealed to you later?
Well, is that person in the room or elsewhere?
It's online.
Online. It's a very good point. It's kind of a mean question because what it says is, I didn't think about it in advance. And it's entirely right. Had I spent enough time in advance, I could have found out some of those things before I got there. But it's true. So yes, and you can, if you want, you can say, well, do I have any right to complain about something that's the result of my not having gotten informed in advance? And maybe not. Good point though. The questioner made a good point. Point for the other team.
I think to follow up on the earlier question, actually, in your book, you do describe, I think, something that is different between like being an international company coming to China versus just the barriers that Chinese companies face, because they very much want to have local champions, right? So you said, the local government wanted to learn from SVB and set up another company. So, the Chinese companies, I think, also face that in a certain business environment, but at least they're local. So the Chinese government wants one of them to win, maybe the one that's friends with someone politically connected, but it'll be one of theirs. And the US company is never really going to be in that position.
That's a really good point. I'm glad you said that. It makes me feel better. I agree with that totally. The other thing that you also made me think of that I forgot to mention before is that there's a difference between the law, with quotation marks in China, and the law in the US. And here's what I mean by that. The laws in the US are on the books, and you can read them. In China, some of the laws are on the books, and some of them aren't. And sometimes people get, and I know numerous cases, by the way, that I prove my point, people get arrested for a law that doesn't exist, for violating a law that doesn't exist. And they can sit in prison for a number of months before the law is put into place. In other words, laws can be created accomplish something that the government wants to accomplish. And so in other words, the laws are more arbitrary. The other thing I would say is the Federal Reserve has been around since, I believe, 1910 or somewhere around World War I. Because we had a central bank in the US that was completely destroyed by President Jackson in the 1830s, who was apparently a kind of a Trump-like figure who wanted to tear the government apart rather than building it up because he was anti-government. And so we went with no central bank from the 1830s. Excuse me, I'm not going to hit you, I'm sorry. I talk with my hands too much. Until I think around 1911 or so, maybe 13, something like that. And then the Federal Reserve came into existence. If the Federal Reserve has this many rules, the CBRC, it's no longer called the CBRC, but it's Chinese, the equivalent of the Federal Reserve in China, has this many regulations. And they're only 25 years old. So how in 25 years did they come up with this many regulations when in 115 years the Federal Reserve only has this many regulations? And the other thing that's interesting is, I know with absolute certainty from having been CEO of a significant bank for 10 years, that you cannot argue with the Federal Reserve. If the Federal Reserve said, you broke the regulation, you have to say, Father, forgive me. And you have to say, what can I do to make it good? But in China, if you break the regulation, you can negotiate. Things are negotiable. So my point isn't US is better, China's worse, or China's better, US is worse. It's just different. It's a different system.
So you mentioned that SVB was kind of replaced, or at least they tried to have you trade a replacement for your company in the to work and fulfill SVB's function in the Chinese tech finance ecosystem. Do you feel like they've been successful, and how sort of efficient and effective do you feel like the tech financing is in China? There's definitely been some, obviously major tech success stories there. Do you feel like capital is allocated to, how is it allocated to companies, and how does that compare to the US? Do you feel like I will ask you to say, is it better or worse, or do you think there's things they should be doing differently?
That's a very tough question to answer. I would like to say I like our system better, because I do, but I probably like our system better because I grew up with it, and I believe in it. The banking system in China is totally different than the banking system in the US. It's tempting to compare the two because they're both called the banking system, but it's like comparing apples with oranges. They're both fruit, but so what? Our bank, if I had understood the way the banking system in China works before I went, I probably never would have gone. Because our business model cannot be used in China successfully because it doesn't fit the banking system. And here's what I mean by that. There are currently about 5,000 banks in the US. When I started in banking 45 years ago, there were 18,000. And the reason that we went from 18,000 to 5,000 is partially because banks get acquired, little ones get acquired by big ones, and partially because banks fail. If banks make too many bad loans, the Federal Reserve or the controller of the currency or the FDIC takes them over and tears them apart and sells off the pieces. And those banks just don't exist anymore. And we were out of 5,000 banks in the US, we had almost no competitors. Because we had a special method and it took a lot of work and other banks didn't want to go to the trouble. So we had almost no competitors in the US. But the Chinese banking system is a totally different kind of a system. If a Chinese, you know how many banks during the reign of the Chinese Communist Party, which has been in charge of China since 1949. That's 51 plus 76 years. Do you know how many banks have failed in China? In 76 years, not one. Because if a bank makes too many bad loans in China, the regulators show up and very quietly put all the bad loans in a dumpster. And that's a metaphor. And they take the dumpster to a landfill and they bury it. And then they quietly recapitalize the bank with taxpayer money. And it keeps on going and very few people actually know what happened. Usually they will grab one or two people who they deem responsible and put them in prison. And our system is a different one. If banks make too many bad loans, the regulators seize them and dismember them, but nobody goes to jail. So it's a totally different system, but you can see why our business model might not work in China. Because even though we weren't allowed to make loans, we were strongly encouraged, you might call it forced, to teach our business model to other banks. And within those first 3 years, there were at least 25 banks that were trying to do exactly what we did. And they weren't the least bit worried about making bad loans. They weren't, because nothing bad would happen. Yeah, sure, maybe the head of their unit would get fired, but they themselves were not likely to get into trouble. So that's another example for the person who's online and calling in of my not knowing enough before I went. And if I understood before I went, and I could have understood because actually somewhere around the time that I left for China, two academicians wrote a book called Red Capital, which describes how the Chinese Communist Party deals with banks that make too many bad loans. If I read that book and understood it, I might have figured, hold it, our business model's not going to work anyway. Reading is a good thing. I would encourage everybody to read. And if I had read more, I would be far better off.